Hey everyone, bro thought he was just working another boring shift at the convenience store. Then one random incident left the girl with nowhere to go, and somehow she ended up moving in with him. So with that said, let's begin the story. Evening was falling over a small Japanese town. Somewhere among the quiet streets, a friendly voice called out to a visitor named Demoto, asking if he would choose a Yumi again. It was an establishment called Sakura Private Women's Academy. Hiromi replied briefly in the affirmative. He came here once a week. It was a service club where you could go on dates with high school girls. Among all the girls, there was one he liked especially well. Hiromi remembered walking into the waiting room and soon hearing a familiar voice apologizing for keeping him waiting, and who promised to take care of him again. Standing before him was Akari, a beautiful girl with short, shoulder-length hair. A couple of days earlier, Hiromi Demoto, who was 29 years old, had woken up. The piercing sound of the alarm clock forced him out of bed. Yawning, he noticed that the photo frame sitting on the desk had fallen over, so he set it right. The photo showed him a woman with long blonde hair and his little sister. Straightening up, the man told himself he would take a shower and head to work. He worked as a manager at a 24-hour store located not far from his home, and the trip there and back took only 30 seconds. Hiromi used to work part-time at another store. But one day, the owner offered him the chance to take on a second one. At first, he refused, unsure of his own abilities, but in the end, he gave in and took on the job. It was scary at first, since he didn't know how it would turn out, but fortunately, everything went well. The store had been in business for 4 years now, with mixed results. A short while later, Hiromi, already dressed and ready, walked into the store, where he was greeted by a blonde girl with long, light hair, wearing shorts and a t-shirt. Without looking up from her phone, she greeted the manager. Hiromi walked over to her and asked if there was anything to report from the previous shift. She replied that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Everything was as usual, no problems. And she called herself super capable. The man looked at her with a squint and reluctantly agreed. This was his colleague, Maika Shinoda. She was 19 years old. It had been 4 years since she'd started working part-time here, and now she had grown so much that she could be trusted to run the store on her own. However, she used to be the prime candidate for dismissal because she constantly left a mess behind and didn't know what to do. Now Maika was leaning against the counter, watching Hiromi change, and asked him to listen to her. Hiromi, pulling his uniform over his clothes, asked if this was another complaint about that guy. Her co-worker replied grumpily that yes, it was, but not exactly. The manager asked if they'd had another fight. Pouting, she explained that the guy had said he didn't have any money for fun and had stolen money from her wallet again. Demoto noted that she'd already told him this, and, pouring himself some coffee, suggested that maybe it was time to break up with him. The girl looked away. Hiromi took a sip and remarked that coffee before work was just a thing. Maika, sounding offended, called him cold-hearted. Just then, another girl with short hair and glasses walked into the staff room. She greeted the manager. Hiromi returned her greeting, addressing her as Sugiura, and added that he'd finish his coffee and come out to help. Her name was Kitoka Sugiura, and she was 26 years old. She told him he didn't need to rush. But then a voice called out from the dining area, asking for someone to come to the register. Kitoka shouted back that she was on her way and hurried over to the customer. She was usually in charge of the night shift and was the first of the part-timers to be hired as a full-time employee. The young woman possessed outstanding skills and a strong sense of responsibility. Hiromi, watching her go, thought that without her, the store wouldn't run properly. Soon, Kitoka returned. She turned to Shinoda and said she'd forgotten to warn her that the other woman could be heard in the room, so they should speak more quietly. Although Hiromi had been working there longer, Kitoka always acted as if she were the shop owner. Then one of the female employees called out to him, inviting him to go out for a drink and chat. The manager replied that he was actually on duty right now, for which he was told off for being cold. When his shift ended, Hiromi announced that he was leaving and handing things over to the morning shift. His co-worker thanked him for his work and asked if he needed a receipt. He declined and took a bag of groceries he'd picked out for himself from the register. He had the day off tomorrow, but he told the girl to call him right away if anything came up. She nodded, confirming that she understood. That's how all his days went. And even though he told his co-workers he'd be at home, there was a place he went once a week. Glancing at his phone, he thought to himself that his appointment was at 7 o'clock today, so he still had some time, and he'd grab a snack to go. That place he went to once a week added a bit of excitement to his routine or served as a sort of respite. He loved stopping by there, and all the staff recognized him. The receptionist greeted him, asking if he was choosing a Yumi again. Hiromi gave a brief nod in agreement. It was his secret adult hideaway, a place to rest and relax, and everyone had their own way of experiencing the establishment. They wished him a pleasant time. If he had to describe it in one word, for him, this place was a club with cute girls in school uniforms. Sitting in the waiting room, he soon saw the girl he always came to see walk in. It was a Yumi, but her real name was Akari. With a smile, she told him to get ready, because today she would take care of him again. They sat in front of the TV, gripping their controllers, playing a car racing game, turning the steering wheels, and cheering each other on. Akari noticed that he wouldn't get away, even if he kept moving around so much. Hiromi sighed intermittently, staring intently at the screen. The girl asked if he could tell that she was almost done. The red armor once again decided the outcome of the race right before the finish line, even though Hiromi was already close to winning. Smiling, Akari announced that she had beaten him again. The man clicked his tongue and remarked that if this were the old version of the game, he would have one. The girl called it the excuses of a loser, but he insisted that the controls and systems were different. As she put away the game disc, she said that if he was so sure, he could bring his own game. Hiromi agreed. Ayumi was her stage name. The girl's real name was Fujimura Akari, and he knew that. Hiromi recalled how, 3 months ago on that day, he'd gone out for a drink to listen to Shinoda's complaints. She had mentioned that she liked the three of them to hang out together. However, his colleague had simply forgotten that she'd already made plans to meet a friend. The man had shrugged at the time, agreeing that she could come along if she didn't mind. The girl was delighted and replied that she would ask her right away. Hiromi thought that such get-togethers hardly fell within the scope of a manager's duties. His first impression of Fujimura was formed that very evening. She approached him, greeted him, and asked if he was the manager. She apologized for keeping him waiting. Hiromi replied sheepishly that she had been invited first and apologized as well. The young woman smiled and said it was no big deal. After all, it was Maika. She turned out to be a friend of his colleague. The man remembered her perfect, professional smile. The three of them sat there drinking. Fujimura remarked that the manager could hold his liquor, and she asked, "How many glasses is this now?" Hiromi exhaled and joked that, in fact, beer was flowing through his veins instead of blood. The girl laughed, calling it nonsense. Tilting her glass toward her mouth and leaning on her arm, she added that Maika was quite the lady too. She called him over for a drink to complain about her boyfriend, but as soon as he called to apologize, she immediately melted and took off. Hiromi smirked, calling it only fair. Fujimura suggested that by now they were probably already having fun at the hotel. The man, flustered by her words, replied uncertainly, "Who knows?" The girl pointed her chopsticks at his plate and asked if she could take some tomato slices. He said yes, and she thanked him sweetly. For a first date, she was joking too freely about such topics, Hiromi noted to himself. He mentioned that Shinoda had talked about a fight with her boyfriend over her part-time job. He asked about the name of the place, JK Refra. The name sounded suspicious, so he asked Fujimura if she knew anything about it. She looked away and hesitantly admitted that she did, because she worked there picking up a slice of lime from her lemonade with her chopsticks. Hiromi, feeling embarrassed, apologized for his thoughtless words. She added that she wasn't hiding anything and that there was nothing to be ashamed of. Besides, it wasn't quite what he thought. The girl giggled, leaned on her arm, and, looking at him, asked if he was really curious. The man was embarrassed but nodded. Then she suggested he stop by sometime. She added that she had a work account. She held out her phone to him, showing him a website titled Tada Private Girls Academy and Ayumi, Sakujo's profile. It said that she attended Tada Private Girls Academy, loved sweets, and responded depending on her mood, and it also listed 35 follows and 120 followers. A pinned post from February 14 said that Ayumi was at the store again today, eating sweets and waiting for her older brothers, and that if no one came, she'd get fat, so they should look out for her figure and come visit her. The girl asked if he had read it. Hiromi didn't say anything, he just smiled. Then she said she'd wait for him at the salon, and he snapped back that he wouldn't come. That's what he said back then, but 3 months have passed, and now he's become a regular customer, going there once a week. The man still couldn't wrap his head around how it had happened. They tried a few different game modes. Akari said she was already tired of this game, so Hiromi suggested tennis or ping pong. The girl replied with a smile that that wasn't what she meant. After all, he'd signed up for an expensive package with unlimited options, and there were other things they could do. Moving closer, she playfully whispered in his ear about the possibility of lying on his lap or together. The man replied with a smile that he really did love to play, and that winning table tennis 11 was incredibly fun. Akari looked at him and saw not a trace of lust in his eyes. He really just wanted to play. As she looked at him, she wondered why this man chose only her, paid such a lot of money, and still came just to play games. Usually, men go to places like this to take advantage of various options, to lie down with a girl, to touch her in different places without sexual intercourse, or to look at cute outfits. They clearly have ulterior motives. Sometimes, of course, there were strange guys who talked about finding true love, claimed they were looking for the one, and didn't order any extra services. But Hiromi didn't seem like that. He was just playing a game. The girl didn't mind. But when, in a place like this, a guy didn't want anything from her, it stung her pride a little. Moving closer, she brushed against his chest and asked if he worked out, noting how broad his chest was. The man replied that he just walked from home to work. Akari thought that since he was paying so much money, he had to enjoy the character of a Yumi that she was creating. With a smile, she remarked on how good his shampoo smelled, and looking into his eyes, she playfully asked if he'd taken a shower. Hiromi asked her to stop, gently but without completely pushing her away. At that moment, the girl pushed him down onto the bed, wrapped her arms around him, and declared a mandatory lying together regimen. The man shook his head in embarrassment, asking, "What do you mean by mandatory regimen?" Akari wanted him to get his money's worth. Looking him in the eyes, she asked him to hold her tighter, adding that she looked slimmer in her clothes, but her thighs were very soft, and he would like them. She draped her leg over his stomach, and he again asked her, somewhat embarrassed, to stop. The girl realized that she'd feel uncomfortable otherwise if he didn't interact with her at all. Hiromi called her by name sternly, but with a smile, and he asked her to stop. He said he was just a gamer who liked to play with someone else, and that it would be better to play a game of ping pong. That's what's really fun. Akari turned away, offended, coldly refused, and added that if he loved games so much, he should play by himself. She remained alone on the bed, hugging her pillow, while the man sat on the floor in front of the TV and actually started playing. Watching him, she thought he was really doing it. He took a shower, shaved, and came back fully prepared. And he's ignoring her for the sake of ping pong. She didn't understand at all. Why does he come here? Why doesn't he touch her? Why does he choose her of all people? Too many questions remained unanswered. Without realizing it, she had fallen asleep on the bed. His jacket was draped over her. The manager approached her, woke her up, and asked if she was awake. Akari let out a sharp cry when she recognized Mako. He noticed that she had been sleeping soundly. The girl immediately asked where Hiromi was, and the manager replied that he had left a long time ago. Akari couldn't believe it. Remembering something, the young man handed her a photo of her sleeping soundly, drool dripping from her mouth. Embarrassed by the awkwardness, she called it a nightmare. The manager grinned, noting how funny her face looked right now. Akari looked at the photo, and at the bottom it was captioned, "Thanks for your work." She wondered what kind of thanks for your work this was supposed to be. After all, people usually say great, or it was a pleasure. Meanwhile, Hiromi had returned to the store and was standing behind the counter next to his coworker. He apologized for making her wait until lunchtime, but she replied that it was no big deal. Today he was filling in for Shinoda, who was out sick with a cold. She really shouldn't have stayed out all night at karaoke, he thought to himself. Another coworker asked what the manager did on the weekends. The man replied that he often plays all kinds of games. He knew he wasn't lying, but he had no intention of mentioning the place he'd been to. The coworker looked away and remarked that it had been a long time since they'd worked the register together, which made her feel like a newbie again, reminding her of her internship. Hiromi agreed with her. He apologized for often leaving her alone in the store, but added that she was a great help. The girl asked shyly if that was really true, and was delighted by his words. The man remembered Shinoda's salary, which she would receive in the form of groceries from their store, and chuckled. His colleague called him a cruel manager. Sitting at home, Hiromi poured himself some soju into a glass with ice. As he took a sip, he thought it tasted good and that he'd done a good job today. Looking at the laptop in front of him, he recalled Akari's eyes when she told him to play by himself, since he loved games so much. Taking another sip, he reflected that it added up to a decent amount each month. But for him, it was a casual relationship that unfolded in a relaxed atmosphere. Suddenly, the phone rang from the store, and he looked at the screen in surprise. When he answered the call, he immediately heard the agitated voice of his employee, Sugiura. She apologized for bothering him so late and reported that there were problems at the store. The manager grew wary and asked what had happened. The employee explained that a customer had come into the store who had already been banned from entering, and now he was harassing people around him. She asked Hiromi to come as soon as possible. As the young woman spoke, a rough male voice could be heard coming through the phone. The stranger was persistently trying to get the employee's attention, inviting her to have a drink with him at. She calmly but firmly replied that such behavior was unacceptable. Upon hearing this, Hiromi immediately told her to wait a moment, because he was already on his way. On the way, the man couldn't help but reflect on how incidents like this happen quite often at night. In most cases, alcohol was to blame. Under its influence, people lost their self-control, found the courage to say whatever came to mind, and often revealed the most unpleasant aspects of their character. Upon arriving at the 24-hour store, the manager immediately approached the rowdy customer. Standing before him was a man older than him, but noticeably shorter. The man asked irritably, "Do they have absolutely no respect for me?" Hiromi calmly reminded him that he had already told him more than once that he was banned from the store. The man began to protest loudly, declaring that he earned 10 million a year, and asked who exactly his interlocutor was. Hiromi replied calmly that he was the one in charge of the store. With a dissatisfied thump on the trash can, the customer declared that he just wanted to meet someone, then clicked his tongue in annoyance. And finally, he left. When the altercation was over, the frightened employee approached the manager and handed him a napkin, telling him that the man had managed to spit in his face. Hiromi only noticed this now. With a disgruntled sigh, he said she should wash her face first. The girl apologized guiltily for calling him in the middle of the night. He calmly replied that nothing serious had happened. He then immediately asked if she was okay. Sugiura assured him that she was fine, but explained that the visitor had managed to harass one of the customers. That person was now resting in the back room. After listening to her, the manager asked the employee to keep an eye on the store while he spoke with the visitor. The girl confidently agreed. Opening the door to the back room, Hiromi greeted him politely, apologized for the inconvenience, and asked if everything was all right. In response, he was surprised to see Akari. The girl was sitting calmly inside, not looking frightened at all. A slight smile played on her face. Looking at the man, she remarked with interest that she hadn't expected to see him being so loud at work. Then, with a smile, she asked if he always behaved that way during his shift. The manager looked at the girl in confusion, completely baffled as to why she was there. He asked her directly what she was doing in the store. Akari replied casually that she had just happened to stop by. The man asked again, was it really just a coincidence? Instead of explaining, the girl smiled and suggested they go out for a drink. Hearing this suggestion, Hiromi was surprised and replied that he was planning to go home to rest. Akari, glancing briefly at her phone, asked for at least one small shot. The manager refused right away. However, he soon agreed anyway, deciding to consider it a sort of compensation for the time he'd once taken a photo of her while she was asleep. Before long, they were sitting in a 24-hour restaurant. Without much hesitation, the girl ordered another glass of plum wine from the waiter. Hiromi reminded her, in surprise, that she had promised to limit herself to just one shot. Despite this, the conversation dragged on, and they spent almost the entire night eating and drinking. The next morning, Hiromi woke up on the floor of his own living room, covered with a blanket, with a pillow under his head. When he heard the alarm go off, he turned it off, and he felt a severe headache. It took him a moment to realize that he had clearly had one too many drinks the night before. Looking around, he couldn't figure out why he'd been sleeping on the floor in the first place. Gradually, the events of the previous night began to come back to him. He remembered Sugiura's call, the incident at the store, and his encounter with Akari. Just then, a woman's voice suddenly rang out nearby. The girl calmly handed him a mug of hot coffee. Out of habit, Hiromi thanked her, but it took him a moment to realize what was happening. Turning sharply, he saw Akari standing next to him, wearing his shirt. She cheerfully wished him a good morning. The manager was completely flustered. He immediately asked why she was at his house and what had happened. Taking a calm sip of coffee, Akari replied that she had simply stayed over at his place. These words completely baffled the man. He couldn't for the life of him understand how things had come to this and why the girl was now in his apartment. Akari was surprised by his reaction and was about to remind him exactly what had happened the previous evening. However, she suddenly glanced at the clock. She immediately noticed that the alarm had already gone off and warned him that he might be late for work. Realizing this, Hiromi jumped out of bed instantly and began getting ready in a hurry. Once he was at work, the manager kept mentally replaying the events of the previous night. He remembered how, after his shift, Akari had persuaded him to go out for a drink, and then their conversation came back to him. The girl, awkwardly holding a glass of alcohol, admitted that she had nowhere else to go. Surprised, Hiromi asked what happened. Akari calmly explained that she'd broken up with her boyfriend after a heated argument and had left home. That's when he finally realized why she'd come with a large suitcase. Until then, he genuinely thought she'd just returned from trip. Giving him a pleading look, Akari quietly asked if she could stay with him for a while. The manager immediately dismissed the idea as nonsense and flatly refused. The girl then said sadly that, in that case, she would have to spend the night right on the street. Hiromi thought to himself that such a request smacked of manipulation, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her in that situation either. Since it was already late at night, he allowed her to stay at his place just this once. Now, however, the man had no idea what to do next. He couldn't force her out, so he decided to calmly finish his workday first and then think about a solution. Stepping out of the store's back room, the manager told Sugiura that he would take over at the register himself and that it was time for her to take her break. The young woman turned around and readily agreed. After a brief pause, the employee apologized once more for having to call her boss that night. Hiromi calmly replied that she shouldn't worry about it. Then the young woman cautiously asked if yesterday's customer was someone he knew. The man was surprised by the question and wondered why she had come to that conclusion. Kitoka explained that they'd been interacting too casually, which was why she'd gotten that impression. Slightly embarrassed, Hiromi looked away and explained that Akari was just an acquaintance of his. The girl nodded understandingly, accepting his answer. Then she sincerely admitted that she'd felt a huge sense of relief when the manager arrived that night, since it would have been very difficult for her to handle the situation on her own. Hiromi calmly said that in such cases, she shouldn't hesitate to ask for help. If any intruder showed up again, she should call him right away. The employee looked silently at her boss and smiled warmly, and she suddenly realized that he would surely make a wonderful father. Hearing those words, the man was genuinely surprised. He thought about how he would indeed turn 30 this year, but he still didn't understand why the young woman had suddenly come to that conclusion. Kotoka looked at her boss curiously and asked if he ever wanted to start a family. Hiromi, folding his arms across his chest, paused to think for a moment. He remembered that he had indeed thought about this before. The young woman said with a smile that she had always imagined him as a caring father who would genuinely cherish his family. The man, feeling a little embarrassed, admitted that he couldn't picture himself in that role at all. Then the employee suggested with a smile that perhaps the role of an older brother would suit him better. Hearing this, Hiromi merely smiled slightly. He calmly replied that even that comparison didn't quite fit him. Meanwhile, Akari was still at Hiromi's apartment. Making herself comfortable, she watched some kind of entertainment show on her tablet, occasionally recalling how the man had just recently and confidently put a drunk store customer in his place. As she thought about him, she involuntarily looked around. The apartment looked clean and tidy. Everything was in order. There were no unnecessary items or scattered trash anywhere. You could tell right away that a mature and organized person lived here. This scene reminded the girl of her ex-boyfriend's apartment. Compared to Hiromi's place, the difference seemed enormous. Memories flashed before her eyes. Back then, when she returned home, Akari had said hello. But instead of a reply, she heard the irritated exclamations of Tatsuya Nagai. Without looking up from his video game, was swearing loudly while holding a game controller. The girl gave him a disgruntled look and asked if he wasn't supposed to be working a shift for the agency today. Without even glancing in her direction, the guy replied indifferently that he'd already quit. Stunned, Akari asked again, "Did I hear that right?" Tatsuya declared that he wanted to spend his weekends gaming and training. The girl asked in confusion, "What kind of training are you even talking about?" She reminded him that he should be thinking about getting a normal job. Then the guy calmly announced that he had decided to become a professional esports player. Akari was even more surprised, since he had never mentioned this before. Tatsuya enthusiastically began explaining that esports is currently booming in the country, with new teams popping up one after another. Very soon, one of these teams will be holding tryouts, and he was determined to make the cut. The girl asked, "How are we going to make ends meet all this time?" Glancing around the room, she noticed trash bags scattered about, but she started unpacking the groceries she'd brought anyway. She calmly pointed out that his part-time job alone wouldn't even cover 100,000 yen a month. She added that they'd also have to pay for the apartment and the car. The guy just replied nonchalantly that they'd manage somehow. Akari couldn't understand how anyone could be so carefree about such things. Then Tatsuya added that he wasn't going to pay for the apartment on his own, since they lived together. Surprised, she reminded him that he was the one who had once declared that this was his home and that he would never let a woman pay for housing. Clicking his tongue in annoyance, the guy snapped that the money she earned was dirty anyway. Akari immediately asked what he meant by that. Tatsuya dismissively declared that it was easy for women. All they had to do was work as escorts to make big money. The girl sharply objected, explaining that the place where she worked had absolutely nothing to do with that. However, the guy just waved her off, claiming that all such establishments were the same, and then reached for a cigarette. Then Akari asked irritably, "Who are you, then, if you're going to live off the very money you consider dirty?" She remarked sarcastically that he seemed more like someone who just wanted to freeload off of it. Tatsuya gave her a disgruntled look, not expecting that response. The girl immediately reminded him that she'd asked him more than once not to smoke in the room, because the clothes would end up smelling like cigarettes. In response, the guy coldly declared that it was his house, and if she didn't like something, she could leave. Akari replied without hesitation that that was exactly what she would do. Opening her suitcase, she quickly began packing her things. Only then did Tatsuya realize that she was serious. He tried to stop her, but it was already too late. Soon, Akari left the apartment. Without knowing why, she headed straight for that 24-hour store. She wasn't going there specifically because of Hiromi. Rather, her feet had carried her there on their own, where she had accidentally bumped into that very same drunk customer. Returning to the present, Akari felt her throat go dry. She got up from the couch and headed to the kitchen. Opening the fridge, she decided out of curiosity to see what Hiromi usually kept at home. However, it turned out to be almost empty. On the shelves were only a package of sauce, a little cheese, a few tubes of seasoning, a couple of bottles of drinks, and almost nothing else. Closing the fridge, Akari realized that the man hardly ever cooked at home. Meanwhile, Hiromi finished his workday, said goodbye to his co-workers, and headed home. On the way home, he kept thinking about the unexpected situation. The girl had appeared in his life too suddenly, and now he had to decide what to do next. When he opened the apartment door, he immediately saw Akari. She was wearing an apron, and she greeted him with a smile and wished him a good evening. The man reminded himself that he absolutely had to have a serious talk with her today. Before he even had a chance to take off his shoes, he brought up yesterday's request. Akari calmly replied that she was listening carefully, but immediately steered the conversation in a different direction. With a smile, she told him that dinner was almost ready, suggesting that he take a bath first, and then they could discuss everything calmly. Hiromi tried to object, realizing that she was simply distracting him from the conversation. But the girl, gently nudging him forward, kept insisting that it would be much more comfortable to talk over dinner. The man resisted a little longer, but eventually gave in and asked her to at least stop pushing him. Once in the bathroom, he sank into the hot water with pleasure. Feeling the tension gradually melt away, Hiromi exhaled with relief. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd taken a proper bath, since he usually limited himself to a quick shower. Now, it felt as if all his accumulated fatigue was washing away with the hot water. As he relaxed, the man looked at his wet hand and suddenly remembered that when he'd come home, Akari's hair had still been damp, too. That meant she'd already had a bath. A little while later, after changing into his pajamas and drying his hair with a towel, Hiromi came out of the bathroom. In the kitchen, he saw Akari standing by the stove. The girl asked with a smile if he'd managed to warm up properly in the hot water. The man sincerely thanked her for running the bath for him, then returned to the serious conversation. He calmly explained that he'd only let her stay the night because there simply hadn't been any other option yesterday, and now he wanted to know if she decided what to do next. However, instead of answering, the girl handed him a bowl of soup and asked him to help set the table. After a moment's hesitation, Hiromi agreed. Soon the table was laden with various dishes, and they sat down across from each other. Akari breathed a sigh of relief, admitting that she was terribly hungry, and then suggested they finally start eating. As he looked over the numerous dishes, Hiromi was surprised to realize that the girl had prepared all of this herself. Akari pressed her palms together, wishing him bon appetit in a Japanese tradition. The man calmly returned the gesture, and he tasted the miso soup. Sensing an unusual flavor, he immediately noticed an unfamiliar tartness with a slightly sweet undertone. With a satisfied smile, the girl asked if he had noticed it. After thinking for a moment, Hiromi guessed that vinegar had been added to the soup. Akari happily confirmed his guess. She explained that she had once seen this cooking method on a TV show and had been making it that way ever since. The man admitted that it turned out to be quite interesting. Then he added that if she added a little more of the other ingredients, the vinegar wouldn't overpower the flavors of the other ingredients so much. The girl smiled and promised she'd definitely do that next time. Hiromi automatically agreed, but a second later, he froze with the chopsticks in his hands. Realizing what he'd said, he asked in surprise, "What do you mean next time?" Akari calmly replied that next time would remain next time. The man looked at her skeptically and asked point blank, "Are you really going to move in with me?" The girl calmly nodded, confirming his guess. Hiromi immediately shook his head, firmly stating that this wasn't possible and that it was a completely ridiculous idea. Akari asked with genuine curiosity why he thought so. The man explained that they weren't even dating yet, and she was already suggesting they live together. Then the girl, with a light smile, suggested they just start dating. Hearing this, Hiromi was completely flustered and didn't know if she was serious. In response, Akari remarked with a smile that she, in fact, had some questions of her own. She reminded him that the girl he always chose at the parlor had come to his place on her own, and asked if he really wasn't happy about that at all. Hiromi calmly replied that he only went to the parlor to relax and have a good time, involuntarily recalling how he and Akari used to just play video games together. Akari opened a can of soda, took a few sips, and, smiling, began to mimic Hiromi. She jokingly repeated his words about how he came to her salon just to relax, then noted that for this, he was willing to spend more than 10,000 yen every time, without even ordering any additional services. The man calmly replied that everyone has their own quirks. He then firmly reiterated that he had no intention of accepting her offer. The girl immediately began pleading with him, persistently repeating her request. Hiromi just shook his head, unwilling to change his mind. Then Akari asked if she could live with him for at least half a year. The man automatically asked her to repeat herself, after which she corrected herself and said she only needed 1 year. Hearing this, Hiromi asked in surprise, "Why exactly 1 year?" The young woman calmly explained that she was in a difficult financial situation right now, but she planned to save up money and eventually live on her own. After listening to her, the man realized that she simply wanted to stay with him until she could get back on her feet. Akari confirmed with a smile that that was exactly the case. Then Hiromi, jokingly mimicking her, replied that she hadn't hit the mark at all. Ignoring his words, the girl pointed toward the vacant Japanese-style room and said she could use it for her live streams. The man asked in surprise, "Are you really serious? As if I'm already obligated to give you a room?" He thought to himself that Akari took life too lightly. After a brief pause, Hiromi suggested she go back to her parents, since they lived somewhere nearby. However, the girl firmly stated that this option was completely out of the question. After that, she promised to faithfully handle all the household chores, cook meals, and keep the apartment tidy. With a sly smile, Akari added that she could take care of other things as well. Realizing what she was hinting at, Hiromi immediately stopped her and firmly said that he had no intention of starting a relationship with her. The girl then casually suggested they just stay friends. The man just looked at her in confusion, unable to understand how she could speak so calmly about such things. He honestly admitted that he wasn't the kind of person capable of acting so unprincipled. Akari remarked with a smile that he turned out to be a surprisingly decent person. Looking at the girl, Hiromi fell deep in thought once more. It seemed to him that it was Akari who was living too recklessly, as if she were constantly walking a tightrope over an abyss. He had no intention of judging her lifestyle, realizing that everyone has their own circumstances. However, he could sense how fragile she looked beneath all her carefree demeanor. Meanwhile, the girl offered him some yakisoba to try, explaining that she'd made the sauce using her own recipe. She advised him to mix it with an egg yolk first. As Hiromi tasted the food, he kept thinking that one day this kind of life might lead Akari into serious trouble. That was exactly why it was hard for him to just leave things as they were. With a heavy sigh, the man finally said that it would only be for 1 year, roughly until next April. Hearing these words, the girl immediately sensed that he was beginning to give in and looked at him hopefully. Then Hiromi hastened to clarify that he had no intention of living with her as a couple. He was merely willing to let her use a spare room for that time. Before he could finish speaking, Akari joyfully jumped to her feet and sincerely thanked him. The man could only think wearily that he didn't understand how he'd let himself be talked into this again. To take his mind off these thoughts, he continued with dinner. After tasting the potato salad, Hiromi praised the dish with genuine surprise, admitting that it turned out very tasty. Sometime later, Hiromi settled in front of the TV with his food. The news reported that seawater had been unexpectedly discovered in Saitama Prefecture during a groundwater survey. A whole week had slipped by unnoticed since Akari had moved into his home. All this time, the girl had been closely observing Hiromi and gradually began to have strange thoughts. She understood that she was living under the same roof as a grown man, so it seemed perfectly natural to her that sooner or later he might want to get closer to her. The very thought of this seemed perfectly logical to her, although, upon catching herself having such thoughts, she admitted to herself that she didn't have any romantic feelings for him at all. If nothing ever happened between them, she wouldn't let it bother her. However, something else entirely continued to trouble her. Hiromi hadn't asked for anything in return. In her opinion, it would be natural to expect at least some gratitude from someone who had unexpectedly moved into a stranger's home. But not only did the man not charge her for room and board, he also regularly left her money for groceries. She remembered how she once found a bill and a note in which Hiromi had written that it was money for dinner. It was precisely this selfless attitude that embarrassed her the most. Akari felt awkward and realized that if she was going to live here peacefully for the next year, she needed to shake off that feeling. Deciding to bridge the gap between them, even just a little, she suggested they have a drink. She explained that a co-worker had given her an expensive bottle of sake and offered to open it with him. The man was surprised and asked if she was sure, since the gift was surely valuable. Akari replied with a smile that she considered it a small token of gratitude for all his kindness. To herself, she decided that alcohol would help make the conversation more relaxed and relieve them both of their constant awkwardness. After a few cups, Hiromi's face turned noticeably red, and her speech became slower and more relaxed. Akari asked if he liked the sake. The man honestly admitted that the drink was very pleasant and surprisingly easy to drink. Hearing this, the girl smiled contentedly. Then she suddenly remembered that, along with the bottle, she had been given another unusual item. Hiromi asked curiously what she was talking about. At that moment, Akari reflected that alcohol really does lower people's guard and make them much more open. After a brief pause, she explained that her friend, in addition to her main job, worked part-time for an aromatherapy home service, and the item she'd been given was used there as one of the supplementary accessories. The girl, continuing to calmly observe Hiromi's reaction, thought that in a situation where a man and a woman were alone together in a closed room, such an idea might well help ease the remaining tension between them. Akari suddenly appeared in front of Hiromi wearing an unusual outfit, adjusting her top slightly and asking with a smile if it looked good on her. She was wearing a form-fitting swimsuit that accentuated her curves. The man, glancing at her, immediately gasped in confusion and asked, "What on earth did you change into?" The girl just smiled carefree, as if she saw nothing strange in it, and then asked if he'd had a chance to take a bath yet. Hiromi asked in bewilderment, "What are you getting at?" Then Akari offered to help him practice aromatherapy massage a little. Before the man could even fully grasp what was happening, he found himself in the bathroom with his back exposed, getting ready for the treatment. He was sitting on a stool in front of her. He asked, bewildered, what kind of practice she was talking about, and he asked the girl to leave, insisting that he could handle it just fine on his own. However, Akari calmly explained that the friend who had given her this work uniform had recently invited her to try her hand at an in-home aromatherapy service, telling her that she could make good money doing it. Hearing this, Hiromi asked in surprise, "Are you serious?" The girl admitted that she had indeed become interested, but since she'd never done anything like that before, she wanted to get at least a little practice first. The man just sighed heavily and remarked that she thought about money too often. Deep down, Akari knew the offer was real, so she wasn't lying to him, even though she had no intention of actually taking such a job. After all, there were risks involved. Pushing those thoughts aside, she calmly said she'd just help him wash his back instead. Hiromi reluctantly agreed, asking only that she finish quickly. Wetting the washcloth, Akari began to gently rub his back. As she did so, she suddenly asked what he would think if she actually started working at a place like that. Without turning around, the man paused briefly before honestly admitting that he wouldn't like it at all. The girl asked if that meant he would start to feel disgust toward her. Hiromi immediately shook his head and calmly replied that that wasn't the issue at all. Most likely, he would simply feel very sad. Hearing this answer, Akari paused briefly, continuing to gently rub his back with the washcloth. She quietly repeated his words and remarked with a slight smile that he really was a very kind person. Hiromi, already starting to feel awkward, asked her to finish up. Instead, the girl continued washing his back with one hand while using the other to massage his shoulders. The man immediately warned her that if she didn't stop, he would really get angry. Akari calmly replied that if she ever did agree to work in the outcall service, she'd have to get used to procedures like this anyway. As she spoke, she leaned even closer to him, continuing the massage and pressing her chest against his back. At one point, her hand glided smoothly over his shoulder and then down toward his chest. With a soft smile, the girl said that Hiromi did so much for her, so she could provide a special service just for him. Her hand slid down his torso toward the towel. She also added, "Did you notice that this swimsuit isn't just small, but it's also unlined, which makes the fabric feel very thin?" Suddenly, the man firmly stopped her, gently taking her hand. In a calm but firm voice, he told her that she absolutely didn't need to force herself to do things like that. He reminded her that he had no intention of kicking her out of the house. Therefore, she shouldn't feel obligated to repay him in any way. Akari froze, looking at him in confusion. She hadn't expected to hear such words at all and didn't immediately understand exactly what he meant. A few seconds later, the girl jumped to her feet, grabbed the basin of water standing nearby, and poured it over her head, as if trying to cool down the flood of emotions. All she could think to herself was that she absolutely didn't want to be the kind of person who only receives help without giving anything in return. She didn't want to feel like a parasite, completely dependent on someone else. Giving in to her irritation, Akari declared loudly that he had completely ruined her mood. Then she added angrily that he'd just have to keep handling everything on his own from now on. With that, she left the bathroom. A little later, she was sitting in her room, having changed into her usual pajamas and drying her wet hair with a towel. Grumbling discontentedly under her breath, Akari couldn't for the life of her understand where an unmarried man got such unshakable composure. She was certain that even her carefully laid out plan hadn't made the slightest impression on him. Irritably punching her pillow with her fist, she began calling him stubborn, and she mentally fumed over just how ridiculous the whole situation had turned out. However, she soon remembered his words again, that he had no intention of kicking her out of the house. Those words gradually helped her calm down. Looking around, Akari suddenly realized that, probably for the first time in her life, she now had a room of her own. The apartment was quiet and peaceful. After thinking about it for a moment, she decided she was actually starting to like this kind of life. Just then, her phone vibrated. A new message from her ex-boyfriend appeared on the screen. Tatsue asked briefly, "Where are you right now?" A couple of days later, Hiromi Demoto came to his store and decided to buy a few items. Kitoka Suura rang up his Kajitsu scoops, a giant cone, ice cream in bottles, and another ice cream, after which she announced a total of 7,800 yen. Apologizing timidly, she said she would pay for the melted ice cream as well. Hiromi, holding the bag, told her not to worry and to forget about it, since it was his own fault for forgetting to explain how to properly freeze the plastic bottles. Kitoka wanted to say something, but Maika Shinoda cut her off and started teasing her friend. The blonde remarked with a smirk that you can't just stick warm bottles straight into the freezer. That's because the temperature in the freezer drops sharply and the food can spoil, so you have to let it cool down first. Demoto, looking at the blonde, remarked that when someone who'd messed up like that a bunch of times himself says that, It sounds very convincing. Maika shot him a disapproving look. Kitoka, on the other hand, timidly asked her boss if he was going out with anyone today to have a drink. She explained that whenever he was planning to go out, he didn't buy alcohol to bring home, so that's what she'd assumed. Hiromi realized he'd been found out. After all, he'd had one too many yesterday and messed up, so he decided to cut back for a while, but he couldn't very well tell them that outright. In the end, he replied that during his physical exam, they'd told him his uric acid levels were a bit high. Kitoka nodded understandingly and apologized for prying into his personal life. In fact, rumors had already started spreading among the staff, she added. Maika was listening intently. Her friend fidgeted with her fingers and noted that lately he'd stopped taking takeout meals home. Kitoka looked at Hiromi sheepishly and cautiously admitted that she and her co-workers had already started to wonder if he had someone who cooked for him at home. Maybe even a girlfriend. The man looked at his colleague in surprise, then couldn't help but chuckle. He calmly replied that there was no girlfriend and that he had simply started cooking for himself. To himself, Hiromi noted with surprise that his co-workers seemed to be keeping tabs on even his grocery shopping. He immediately thought that Shinoda, a notorious gossip, was surely spreading such rumors. Glancing away for a moment and then back at Kitoka, the man simply smiled good-naturedly. The girl nodded understandingly, saying that everything was clear to her now. Hiromi confirmed her guess. He decided in his mind that he wasn't going to tell anyone what was really going on at his house. The less people knew about Akari, the easier it would be for everyone. Feeling a little embarrassed, he told the employee that he was heading home and leaving the rest to her. As he was leaving, the man thought that girls can sometimes be very observant, and it's incredibly difficult to hide anything from them. When he got home, Hiromi immediately saw Akari sitting on the floor. Hearing the door open, she greeted him cheerfully and immediately noticed the large bags in his hands. He handed them to her and explained that it was ice cream that was about to be discarded at the store, so now she could eat as much as she wanted. Akari gasped in surprise and began curiously unpacking the contents of the bags. As she was laying out the ice cream, Hiromi noticed that the girl was pouring some kind of liquid into a small bowl. When he asked in puzzlement what exactly she was adding, he heard an unexpected answer. With a satisfied smile, Akari explained that it was sesame oil, which goes surprisingly well with vanilla ice cream. The man shook his head skeptically, but the girl confidently offered him a taste. Hiromi refused at first, but Akari persistently held out a spoonful of ice cream to him, urging him to try at least one bite. Waving her off sheepishly, the man took the bottle of oil. He added it to the ice cream himself and stirred it thoroughly. The girl chuckled quietly, teasing him that he was being shy for no reason at all. While he was stirring the dessert, Hiromi's thoughts returned once again to the events of the previous day. He realized that, despite his decision to let Akari stay with him, they needed to establish clear boundaries right away. For the sake of a peaceful life together, they should maintain a certain distance and avoid any ambiguous situations. After tasting the ice cream, the man was pleasantly surprised. He admitted that the rich aroma of sesame oil paired perfectly with the delicate sweetness of the vanilla ice cream and made the flavor much more interesting. Akari smiled contentedly, as if she had known all along that this would be the case. Soon, the girl stood up and motioned for Hiromi to follow her. The man asked in confusion what happened. However, Akari simply urged him to come closer. Opening the door to her room, she announced with a broad smile that she'd changed the decor a bit. A completely different room appeared before Hiromi's eyes. Now there was new furniture, cute decorations, and ornaments everywhere, and the room itself had taken on a cozy and truly girly look. The man asked in surprise when she'd found the time to do all this. The girl cheerfully admitted that she'd been working on it all day while he was out. She asked a friend to help her transport her purchases in his car, after which she bought everything she needed. Akari proudly noted that now the room finally looked like a real home. She then admitted that she'd never had her own room before, so she'd gotten so carried away with excitement that she'd spent much more money than she'd intended. She even placed special pads under the legs of the furniture in advance so as not to damage the tatami mats. After that, the girl complained with a slight smile that traditional Japanese rooms seemed too boring to her and jokingly suggested swapping rooms with Hiromi. The man immediately refused, calmly replying that he was completely satisfied with his own room. Sitting back down, Akari continued to grumble that the walls here were too rough and that the tatami mats didn't fit the cute interior at all. Hiromi calmly objected, reminding her that tatami mats purify the air, and they help maintain the right humidity in the room. Watching the girl examine her room with genuine delight, the man fell deep in thought again. He didn't want Akari to feel guilty about the circumstances. It was important to him that this house be nothing more than a temporary refuge for her, a place where she could quietly regain her strength and start a new life. He even mentally compared himself to the good-natured village elder from old video games, who offers free shelter to weary travelers. That's exactly why Hiromi didn't want the girl to feel like she had to repay him in any way for his help. Meanwhile, Akari was already hugging her new blanket with a daisy pattern and declared with a smile that from now on, she would definitely be constantly buying new furniture and decorations for the room. And she asked him to get ready. The man asked in surprise, "What should I be getting ready for?" With a mischievous smile, the girl reminded him that a real man doesn't make empty promises. Then she began quoting what Hiromi had told her a few days earlier, reminding him that he had promised not to kick her out of the house. The man asked her, embarrassed, to stop. However, Akari kept smiling and repeating his words, that she didn't need to force herself and that he wasn't going to send her away. Finally feeling flustered, Hiromi tried once again to stop her. After that incident, he firmly decided that it was best not to drink around Akari anymore, or else the consequences could be quite unexpected. Sometime later, Akari returned to her ex-boyfriend's apartment to pick up the rest of her things. The apartment was still a mess. While she was packing her clothes into a suitcase, Tatsuya Nagai, sitting with a cigarette in front of his computer screen, asked without much interest where she was living now. Akari replied irritably that it was none of his business and continued packing her things. The guy smirked and said he was just worried about her. Those words made her think back to the beginning of their relationship. They met through mutual friends about half a year ago. It was Tatsuya who had suggested they start dating. Akari had never chased after good-looking guys and couldn't stand arrogant people. However, back then, she was won over by how understanding he seemed. She remembered especially well how he once calmly said that it didn't matter to him at all where exactly she worked, since that was entirely her own business. At the time, those words seemed like sincere support to her. It wasn't until later that she realized that behind them lay not understanding at all, but mere indifference. At that time, she was constantly moving from place to place, without a home of her own. Sometimes sitting on a bench with a cup of coffee and watching happy couples, Akari would dream especially strongly of one day finding a place she could call home. Returning to the present, she told Tatsuya that he could just throw away the remaining items, then got ready to leave. However, the guy stopped her, and unexpectedly, he brought up the car loan. He reminded her that they'd agreed to pay it off together. Akari calmly replied that the car was registered solely in his name, and that they no longer owed each other anything. Besides, they wouldn't be able to take turns using the car anyway. Tatsuya said irritably that he'd bought the car precisely because she'd wanted one, so now she had to take responsibility. She objected, reminding him that she had asked him to buy an inexpensive car, but he had purchased an expensive SUV without any discussion, one that required huge expenses for gas and parking. The guy tried to justify himself, claiming that she herself had said it didn't matter to her what kind of car they bought. Akari calmly explained that she had meant something completely different. Any sensible person with their income would have chosen a small, fuel-efficient car. After ending the conversation, she firmly stated that this was no longer her problem. As she was leaving, she remarked that since he dreamed of becoming an esports player, he should win tournaments and pay off the loan himself. Enraged, Tatsuya abruptly grabbed her by the arm. Akari was holding a bag in one hand and a suitcase in the other, so she couldn't break free right away. Frightened, she begged him to let her go, but he replied that since he had taken her in, she was obligated to show her gratitude and to keep her promises. Trying to free herself, Akari replied bitterly that all this talk of gratitude and duty was just empty rhetoric. But in reality, he was just upset that now he had to pay for the expensive car all by himself. She yanked her arm sharply, causing Tatsuya to lose his balance, slip, and fall backward down the steps. The girl looked at him in alarm. At that moment, she thought that it was pity, more often than not, that brought her new problems. If she learned to walk by without looking back, perhaps her life would have been much easier. Despite this, Akari still asked anxiously if he had hit his head hard. Meanwhile, after work, Hiromi went out for a drink with his co-workers. Shinoda, already noticeably tipsy, raised her beer glass again and said with a smile that the boss was surely hiding a girlfriend. Hiromi calmly replied that he didn't have a girlfriend. Then Kitoka, flushed from the alcohol, admitted that if the director really did have someone, it would be a real shock to her. The man just sighed heavily and asked why they were so concerned about his personal life in the first place. Shinoda immediately declared that they were all very much interested. Kitoka, looking a little embarrassed, agreed as well. She even joked that employees had a right to know such information about their boss. Hiromi patiently repeated once more that there was no woman with him. Then Kitoka, adjusting her glasses, suddenly suggested that perhaps it wasn't a woman with him at all, but a man. Shinoda immediately picked up on the joke, and then both girls began to take turns coming up with the most absurd guesses. Completely flustered, Hiromi abruptly stopped them, saying they'd gone too far. After that, he announced that the evening was over, paid the bill, and led his colleagues out onto the street. While they were waiting for a taxi, Shinoda suddenly suggested that they all go to the director's house together and see for themselves what he was hiding. Kitoka laughed and supported the idea. The man merely remarked wearily that he could hear every word they were saying. After helping the girls into the car, Hiromi paused to think for a moment. He walked over to a vending machine, inserted some coins, and bought a bottle of water. He realized that all these constant secrets were starting to wear him down. However, at the same time, he couldn't deny that since Akari had come into his life, things had noticeably changed for the better. At home, a hot home-cooked meal was always waiting for him, a bath ready and waiting, and clean clothes. He even recalled how Shinoda had once remarked in surprise that the principal now smelled pleasant, rather than giving off the scent of exhaustion after wearing the same clothes for several days. Hiromi himself couldn't help but smile, remembering that he used to wear the same clothes for several days in a row. He understood that Akari considered all of this her duty, but for a lonely man, such care turned out to be far more valuable than he was willing to admit. When he returned home, the man opened the door and immediately sensed an unusual silence. Usually at this time, Akari was still awake. Peering into the kitchen, he saw the girl sitting on the floor near the kitchen cabinet. She was trembling, her forehead pressed against the cabinet door, and she looked unusually pale. Alarmed, Hiromi immediately ran over to her and asked anxiously, "What happened?" Akari lifted her head and quietly greeted him, but it was clear from her face that she was very frightened. The man asked again, "What happened?" Noticing that the girl was as pale as a sheet, she struggled to find the words and admitted that she had simply been thinking too hard, after which she had trouble breathing. Hiromi took a towel. He gently wiped the sweat from her face, realizing that this condition couldn't be ignored. Then he held out his hand to her and asked if she could stand up. Akari silently accepted his help, and together they stood up. The man saw once again that she was feeling a little better. The girl suddenly looked at his palms and quietly remarked that the skin on his hands was completely rough. Hiromi asked in surprise, then calmly explained that he was constantly washing his hands at work, which was why they had long since become that way. With a slight smile, he added that he considered them the hands of a hard-working person. Hearing these words, Akari recalled a famous line from her favorite anime and couldn't help but smile. Soon, Hiromi poured her some hot tea. After taking a few sips, she gradually calmed down. She apologized guiltily, saying that her behavior had probably ruined his evening completely. The man calmly replied that he hardly ever drinks, so there's no need to worry. After a brief pause, he cautiously asked if she had really gotten so upset just because he'd been late today. Hearing this, Akari suddenly laughed and said that it didn't depend on him that much at all. Hiromi just thought to himself, somewhat displeased, that laughing at someone else's concern wasn't very nice. Hugging her pillow close, the girl remarked with a smile that he was acting almost like a real boyfriend right now. The man was quick to object. Then Akari, feeling a little embarrassed, admitted that she had briefly thought he might be having fun with some other woman. She then clarified that she'd also been thinking of his female co-worker with glasses who worked the night shift. Hiromi confirmed that he had indeed been with his co-workers. The girl remarked thoughtfully that this co-worker seemed very modest, but with some makeup, she'd surely be a real beauty. Then, as if in passing, she added that she also had a very curvaceous figure, especially her chest. The man sighed wearily and asked what difference it made anyway. Akari just shrugged, not wanting to pursue the topic further. After taking another sip of tea and biting into a cookie, Hiromi looked at the girl seriously once more. He reminded her that just a short while ago, she had been sitting in the dark, pale as death, and he asked her to tell him honestly what had happened. After a brief pause, Akari finally admitted that she had gone to her ex-boyfriend's place today to pick up the rest of her things. After listening to the whole story, Hiromi calmly summed it up, noting that it turned out to be a typical post-breakup conflict. He added that her ex was to blame for what happened and had faced the consequences of his own actions. He also reminded her that, despite everything, Akari had still taken him to the hospital after he fell and injured his arm, so she absolutely shouldn't blame herself for what happened. Akari stared silently ahead. After a while, she began telling Hiromi about her ex-boyfriend. She explained that after that fight, Tatsue had injured his wrist. Because of this, he was fired from his part-time job, and he was also unable to make it to the tryouts for the esports team, for which he had been preparing for a long time. A memory flashed before Akari's eyes of her driving him to the hospital. Back then, he had been sitting there with his wrist bandaged and looked extremely annoyed. The girl quietly added that now he was demanding that she, specifically, take responsibility for what had happened. Hiromi asked in surprise, "What kind of responsibility are we even talking about?" Akari shrugged with a sad smile and suggested that he most likely just wanted money. According to her, Tatsue had always been very greedy for money. After listening to her, Hiromi calmly remarked that it had been a typical argument, and that Tatsue was the one who had started using force. In his opinion, the best solution would be to simply stop responding to him and completely ignore his attempts to get in touch. The girl lowered her gaze to her pillow again and said quietly that he had already warned her. If she continued to ignore him, he would go to his superior. Hearing this, Hiromi frowned and asked what a third party had to do with their conflict in the first place. Akari gazed thoughtfully ahead and admitted that when she imagined dangerous people might come after her, and given that there were indeed plenty of shady characters among her acquaintances Tatsue, she was overcome by genuine panic. Hiromi watched her in silence. He realized that all this time she had been left alone with her fears, gradually working herself up until her anxiety became completely unbearable. Curled up into a tiny ball, Akari sat without lifting her head. After a brief silence, the man calmly asked her to give him her ex-boyfriend's phone number. The girl looked at him in surprise. Then Hiromi added that he would talk to Tatsue himself. Akari immediately perked up and hurried to refuse. She insisted she had no right to drag him into this mess. After all, none of this had anything to do with him. However, Hiromi replied firmly that it did concern him. The girl shook her head again, repeating that it wasn't his problem at all. Then the man gently placed his hand on her shoulder, and he calmly said that they lived under the same roof. So what was happening couldn't help but concern him. Akari looked at him in confusion, completely unable to understand why he was willing to go so far for her. A few seconds later, she buried her face in the pillow again and whispered an apology. Looking at her, Hiromi thought that it was already too late to apologize. The next day, his shift came to an end. After changing out of his work uniform, Hiromi told Kitoka that he was leaving the store in her care. He asked her to call him right away if any problems arose. She replied confidently that she understood everything. After saying goodbye to his coworkers, the man headed to the address he needed. Upon reaching the right neighborhood, he looked around and realized he was exactly where Tatsue lived. His gaze immediately fell on a parked car. Recalling Akari's words, Hiromi thought that this was the very car the young man had once bought purely to show off. Approaching the apartment door, he noticed a nameplate reading Tatsue Nagai, and couldn't help but think that the whole thing looked like yet another youthful mistake in the pursuit of imagined coolness. After ringing the doorbell, the man waited calmly. A few seconds later, the door opened. A disgruntled Tatsue appeared in the doorway, his wrist bandaged and a can of beer in his hand. He rudely asked the stranger what he wanted. Hiromi greeted him politely, introduced himself, and reminded him that they had already spoken on the phone. Then he calmly asked about the condition of his hand, noting that, as far as he knew, a sprain should take about 3 weeks to heal. The man's voice sounded calm. However, Tatsue immediately sensed a hidden coldness and asked irritably, "What's the point of this conversation anyway?" Hiromi explained that he would like to try to resolve the conflict peacefully. He apologized for interfering, realizing he was an outsider, but still asked to be heard. Before he could finish, Tatsue snapped, "Who are you to Akari anyway?" He mockingly suggested that he was her new boyfriend. After a moment's thought, Hiromi calmly replied that one could look at it that way. He then suggested they go to the nearest cafe to talk in peace. However, Tatsue lazily declined, saying they could just as easily have the conversation right there. Glancing over his shoulder, Hiromi noticed the mess in the apartment and decided not to go inside. Taking another drag on a cigarette, Tatsue finally suggested they get down to business. Hiromi calmly said that, as far as he knew, what had happened was just a typical accident that occurred during an argument. Upon hearing this, Tatsue immediately flew into a rage. He pointed to his bandaged wrist and declared that he was the one who had been injured. Hiromi then calmly reminded him that he was the one who had used force first. Tatsue angrily slammed his palm against the doorframe and began to make excuses. According to him, he had merely grabbed Akari by the arm, but she started to struggle, which caused him to fall down the stairs. Hiromi, still unperturbed, pointed out that the girl had only started to resist because she didn't want to be touched. However, Tatsue just snapped irritably that now he'd been fired from his job. He'd missed an important audition, and his whole life had gone down the drain. The man calmly asked if that was why he was demanding that Akari take responsibility. Tatsue confidently confirmed it. Then Hiromi asked what exactly he meant by responsibility. The guy replied that he wanted compensation for the damage caused. After that, Hiromi asked if he really intended to involve any of his acquaintances in this if the girl refused to pay. Tatsue smugly confirmed this and declared that he would turn to his boss, whom many people feared. With a gesture, he implied that the man had connections to dangerous people, namely the Yakuza. Hiromi calmly pointed out that such threats could already be considered extortion. In response, Tatsue simply shouted that Akari was entirely to blame. He began to speak rudely about her, claiming that he had provided her with a place to live, only to receive ingratitude in return. Then he proceeded to belittle her job, calling the money she earned dirty and hurling insults at her. As he continued speaking, he suggested that Akari must have managed to save quite a bit of money, since, in his opinion, it's much easier for women to earn money. After listening to this barrage of insults, Hiromi's expression changed for the first time. In a calm but cold voice, he said that Tatsue was already crossing all boundaries. He then went so far as to call him a cheapskate. Hearing this, the guy instantly flew into a rage. He grabbed Hiromi by the collar and demanded that he repeat what he had said. However, Hiromi wasn't the least bit intimidated. Calmly apologizing for his harshness, the man didn't change his expression in the slightest, as if he had no regrets about his words. After a brief pause, he unexpectedly asked if it was true that Tatsue still owed about 2 million yen for the car. The young man confirmed this with some skepticism. Hiromi then calmly offered to pay off half of that amount. He reminded him that Tatsue and Akari had once agreed to pay for the car together, so he suggested counting 1 million yen as the girl's share. The man explained that he didn't want to continue this pointless conflict and suggested they end things right there. Tatsue looked at him skeptically, saying he didn't believe a single word. Hiromi then calmly replied that he could get the cash ready right away. Hearing this, Tatsue was so flustered that he even dropped his cigarette. Meanwhile, Akari stayed at home. She sat motionless in front of the TV. The news was reporting on a bountiful sweet potato harvest in Kagoshima Prefecture, which turned out to be significantly higher than last year's, and also mentioned that last year's harvest had been reduced due to poaching. However, the girl wasn't listening to the anchor at all. She stared blankly at the screen, oblivious to what was happening. Hiromi's serious face flashed before her eyes again. He had calmly said that since they lived under the same roof, her problems were now his as well. She thought that a simple, "I'm sorry," wouldn't be enough here, and that when he came home, she would need to thank him. Just then, the door opened and Hiromi walked in. The girl greeted him, telling him that curry was on the menu for dinner tonight. The man was delighted, calling the curry an excellent choice. She watched him as he hung his coat on the rack and headed to the bathroom to wash his hands. Looking after him in surprise, Akari asked if he had paid for her. As she listened to his story, she tried to make sense of what she'd heard. Hiromi told her not to worry about the money and added that if you converted her housework into a salary, it would amount to more than 3 million a year. The girl let out a sharp gasp, not understanding what he was even talking about. The man explained that she helped him out every day, and he was going to rely on her for the entire coming year. So some 3 times less than her annual salary was actually a good deal. Akari immediately exploded, shouting that profit had nothing to do with it, and asking why he had paid her at all. Hiromi, smiling as he dried his hands with a towel, simply replied calmly that everything was fine. Pressing her hand to her heart, she couldn't for the life of her understand why he'd done that. The man asked her to prepare a change of clothes as he got ready to take a shower. The girl wondered to herself, why was Hiromi going to such lengths for her? She was just a lodger, not even a relative or a girlfriend. Sitting down with her back against the wall, she fell into thought, looking around the room. After a while, night fell. The clock read 2:15. Akari turned on nightlight. Then she crept into Hiromi's room, where he was sleeping soundly in his bed, covered with a blanket. Hearing a rustle, he opened his eyes, and he saw a girl sitting right on top of him, practically hanging over him. She was wearing nothing but a sweater, which didn't really hide her nakedness, and she was completely wet, apparently from a shower. Exclaiming sleepily, he asked what she was doing there. Akari, gazing at him with languid eyes, replied that she was paying him a late-night visit. The man, trying to focus his still, sleepy gaze, asked again, "What on earth are you thinking?" The girl moved even closer and suggested they do just that, spend some time together. Playfully looking into his eyes, she asked, "Can't we?" Hiromi replied that, of course, they couldn't, and called her a fool. Akari continued to tease him, asking, "Why not?" The man began to say that their relationship wasn't what it seemed. But before he could finish, the girl took off her sweater, and he saw wet spots on her body. He looked at her naked body and blushed. Her hand rested on his chest, playing with the fabric of his shirt. He asked her to stop. Akari, giving him a sly look, noticed that he actually liked it and moved her hand lower. Then he grabbed her by the shoulder, told her to know her place, and pushed her away. The girl, giggling, said she didn't mind him acting that way, and if he liked being on top, then so be it. She gently placed her hands on his shoulders, and Hiromi shyly said her name. Grinning, Akari suggested they change into their uniforms, reminding him that men love uniforms. She suggested that Hiromi had gotten hooked on Refra for exactly that reason. The man protested that he wasn't like that. Then the girl began playfully listing the names she might call him in a role-playing game: Sensei, Senpai, Oni-chan. As he looked at her, he blushed, and she quietly said his name. Hiromi suddenly sat up in bed, smirked, and, looking away, asked what had come over her. He reminded her that he'd asked her to stop these strange nighttime antics. Akari sat up and asked what was wrong with him. And why was he rejecting her? Wasn't she good enough? With his back to her, he replied that wasn't the issue and repeated that he had no such intentions. Unable to contain herself, the girl screamed, clutching her sweater, asking why he'd given her all that money then. After all, people usually expect something in return. The man replied that such a thing had never even crossed his mind. Akari stared at him in bewilderment, and she kept exclaiming, unable to understand what he was thinking at all when he parted with such a huge sum of 1 million yen. Looking away and folding his arms across his chest, Hiromi explained that the store was thriving. He had savings, and if a problem could be solved with money, then so be it. The girl objected, saying that if it were just him, she would have done the same, but they were strangers, neither relatives nor lovers. They both fell silent, lowering their eyes. With a trembling voice, she asked again why. He looked up toward the side and was about to say something, but she continued, asking who she really was to him. The man sat back down on the bed, with his back to her. Akari took his hand, touched his shoulder, and whispered in his ear that if he was going to stay silent, he shouldn't have been so kind to begin with. She added that since he was being kind, he should demand payment for it, because she had absolutely no idea what was on his mind, and she hated this feeling that was making her nervous. Looking away sadly, she said she wanted to feel safe, and she asked him not to push her away if she meant even a little to him. If he gives her something, let him take something in return, she said, hugging him from behind and touching his hand. Hiromi uttered just one word, I'm sorry. Sighing, Akari got out of bed, and she put on a sweater. She said he really was a good person, but it was all selfishness, just self-satisfaction. Slamming the door loudly, she left the room. The man stared silently at the closed door. The next morning, Akari disappeared along with her suitcase, and she was no longer in the house. Hiromi went to the store where Kitoka was working at the register, scanning items. There were prepared meals. With a smile, she asked if he'd cooked himself today. The man replied that he had given up on cooking at home. Kitoka, holding a barcode scanner in her hands, expressed her regret since she had really wanted to try the manager's cooking. Hiromi smiled awkwardly and promised to do it some other time. The girl asked if it was really okay, and took him at his word. The man confirmed it and, leaving Kitoka in the store, went out onto the street. It was evening, and a heavy downpour was falling. He crossed the street, passing a no-entry sign with a plaque at the bottom that read, except for bicycles. Hiromi walked along, lost in thought. He entered his empty apartment. He looked around and realized she hadn't come back after all. After taking off his shoes and putting his wet shoes away, the man took off his sweater and thought that, in any case, he'd take a bath first. As he looked at it, he realized the bathtub was empty. After all, Akari always prepared it, so he decided to just take a shower instead. After his shower, Hiromi opened the bag of prepared meals, and he began to heat it up in the microwave. He peeked into the fridge. He remembered there was still some potato salad left. Taking the food, he sat down at the table, opened his laptop, and played a video in which an enthusiastic voice was talking about tuna supposedly caught that morning off the coast of Saitama. And the people in the video laughed in surprise. Opening a beer, Hiromi began to eat. And as he looked at the piece of food held between his chopsticks, he thought back to the girl they'd had lunch with. Just then, the phone rang. It was Kitoka, apologizing for bothering him on his day off. She said something had been bothering her. Hiromi asked, what exactly? She replied that there were still a lot of 10,000 yen bills left in the safe, meant to be transferred to the main office. He sat up straight, realizing he'd completely forgotten about it. He asked her to leave everything as it was for now and promised to look into it tomorrow. Kitoka agreed. Hiromi thanked her and apologized for the extra work, but she assured him it was no big deal and apologized herself for calling so late. After hanging up, the man slumped his head onto the desk and cursed, realizing he'd messed up. Looking at the screen, he saw a video titled My Daughter's First Trip to the Park. In it, a boy was telling a little girl named Ryoko to watch her step, but she fell anyway, and her brother helped her up. Hiromi turned off the video and closed his laptop. He walked over to the kitchen cabinet and took out some hard liquor. He thought that the everyday life he'd assumed would just go on as usual had, unbeknownst to him, come to a definitive end. As he opened the bottle and poured a drink, he reflected that he had simply returned to the life he'd had a month ago, and that's how it should be. But he began to feel very lonely. After downing a few shots, he felt very, very sad. Meanwhile, Akari recalled that she had first turned to escort services back when she was still a student. Back then, she was in utter despair, and she didn't care about anything. And the work itself was a kind of act of self-destruction. It felt to her as if she were selling her youth, using her school uniform as a commodity. In this city, in a sense, she wasn't alone. Those who had no place in either their families or society found refuge right there. This place accepted the girls just as they were, and it remained the only place where they felt needed. Even if it was a form of exploitation to some extent, as long as it filled the void in their souls, everyone was fine with it. The reason she was able to come to her senses and tell herself that this wasn't right lied in the realization that this place was inextricably linked to the absolute concept of personal responsibility. The body, the voice, the clothes, the smell of sweat, saliva, in a world where even excrement has a price. She saw it all with her own eyes. Countless girls became prey to the lusts of strangers here. Akari remembered a girl with glasses named Alice, a straight A student from a prestigious private school. She eventually fell victim to a stalker client. She was attacked and raped in a dark alley at night. But she couldn't bring herself to tell her family about it, and the guy she confided in for comfort dumped her. Having completely lost her mind, Alice began to throw herself into debauchery at that establishment again and again. Akari also recalled another girl, Amiri, who worked at a girls' bar. She found out that her favorite musician from a band had slept with her and several other female fans for financial gain, and she started a knife fight right there in the club. Her passion for the band had cooled, but she'd gotten hooked on host clubs. She'd racked up huge debts there, and soon this girl would probably be sold to a brothel, Akari thought. Smoking a cigarette, she talked about it dispassionately, as if it were someone else's story, and always wore long sleeves. She also recalled Yoko, who had run away from the countryside. The pretty girl seriously dreamed of marrying a dispatcher from the escort service and continued to serve clients one after another, just as she was told. Even when she was at the limit of her physical strength, she used lubricants and local anesthetics to numb the pain. And she sold herself right up until the very end, until she reached the point of no return. In the end, that man disappeared from her life, and Yoko herself was never seen in the city again. Only once did Akari run into her in the red light district. She was wearing provocatively revealing clothes and carrying a bag stuffed with stuffed animals. The girl caught the eyes of passersby, and Akari couldn't bring herself to call out to her. Could I ever end up like that myself? Akari wondered. It was precisely that sense of danger that made her snap out of it. And before it was too late, to wash her hands of it all and walk away. After that, she tried as best she could to return to a normal human life, reading various guidebooks on accounting for beginners, professional certifications, caring for the elderly, and popular professions in Japan. But in the end, nothing worked out. Convincing herself that this place was respectable and that everything would be all right, she was now clinging desperately to this world. Apparently, women like her belong only in the shadows. Is she really going to keep sinking into this bottomless quagmire, like the frog in the fable who doesn't notice the water boiling and just waits to be boiled alive? She didn't want this, and she really didn't want to be here. But she couldn't do anything on her own, and no one could help her. It's just that kindness had never paid off for her. Akari walked slowly through the city's night streets, taking her time and gazing aimlessly around her. As she passed the store where Hiromi Demoto worked, the girl once again became lost in her thoughts. Throughout her entire life, she had almost never had her kindness reciprocated. She had grown accustomed to seeking the easiest paths to salvation and had long since stopped truly trusting people. For her, all relationships were built on calculation and self-interest, things that were easy to understand and measure. That was exactly what she had grown accustomed to over the years. Without even realizing it, Akari had reached the site of her former workplace. Stopping, she recalled the day when she had nowhere else to go. Back then, without understanding why at all, her feet had carried her right to that distant 24-hour store where she'd met Hiromi. Then the memory of that night, when they'd had a fight at his apartment, came flooding back. Recalling how, in her confusion, she had run away from the man's completely selfless kindness, she realized that she had deliberately chosen not to leave a spare key at home. Now, sitting in her usual office at work, Akari thoughtfully twirled that very key in her hands. Glancing at her phone, she noticed a missed call from Hiromi. Somewhere deep inside, a sudden sense of relief washed over her. She caught herself thinking that she felt calmer knowing he had, after all, tried to get in touch with her. What's more, for a moment, it even seemed to her that she'd finally managed to convince herself that he really did care about her. Settling down on the bed and stretching lazily, Akari wondered what she should do next. She realized that she herself had constantly put him through similar tests, expecting something in return. Now all she could do was admit that she'd acted foolishly. However, there was nothing she could do to change things now. Just then, her phone vibrated again. Picking it up, she looked at the screen. She thought that now, truly, nothing could be fixed. No matter how much life had hardened her, no matter how much filth she'd had to endure, deep down, she was still just an ordinary girl. A notification appeared on the screen. The next day, at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, Mr. Demoto had booked an appointment with her again. When she saw this, Akari couldn't help but smile. Deep down, she felt that no one could turn down the chance to be the main character in someone else's story again. The next day, Hiromi did indeed come to see her. Cold drinks with ice were already sitting on a small table, and an old video game was running on the big screen. Instead of their usual conversations, they sat side by side again, competing against each other in races. Akari played without much enthusiasm, while Hiromi was completely focused on navigating the track. After another defeat, he muttered in frustration that he'd lost again and immediately suggested starting another race. Watching him, the girl remembered how he'd once told her about an old game console. Back then, he'd searched for it at home for a long time, but never found it. So he ended up ordering online. They'd already been spending nearly half an hour just like this, simply playing together. And Akari was beginning to realize that today's visit had really been necessary for him, just for this reason. Hiromi crossed his arms over his chest and said thoughtfully that he actually felt a little upset. Then he asked for permission to play through the track quietly once against the clock. The girl smiled and immediately agreed, letting him play alone. As he started another run, the man noticed that the track had been slightly altered in the remake. Fully focused on the game, he suddenly began to reminisce about the past. He explained that on the day the game was released, there was an official speedrun competition. Back then, there was a world record, and everyone who brought their scores to the store was given a commemorative card. In addition, there was a special prize up for grabs, an exclusive, limited edition controller with decorative cat ears. You could only win it through a lottery, so the odds were extremely slim. A small video game store came to Hiromi's mind. It was owned by an elderly man with a mustache who often chatted with the kids and showed them new games. One day, the owner promised that whoever was the first to buy the game from him and bring proof of completion would definitely receive that very controller. Hiromi admitted that he'd been incredibly excited by the idea at the time. He bought the game right away and played through it nonstop, and he was the first to run back to the store. However, it turned out that no such exclusive controller had ever existed. Akari asked in surprise, "How is that even possible?" The man gave a bitter smile and explained that it had all turned out to be a common trick. As soon as the children were promised a rare prize, they immediately ran to buy the game at that very store. And then all they had to do was say that someone else had already claimed the prize. Akari remarked regretfully that treating children that way was very mean. Hiromi nodded in agreement. Then he explained that back then he wanted that controller so badly that he brought his friends along and started demanding the promised prize. In the end, the store owner gave in and handed him the most ordinary controller from the display case. The girl was even more surprised and asked, didn't he specifically want the limited edition? Hiromi suddenly fell silent. While he was recalling those events, his in-game car crashed into an obstacle, and the race ended in defeat. After a brief pause, the man quietly admitted that he didn't need the controller for himself at all. He thought of his younger sister, Ayumi. They couldn't play together, and there was only one controller at home. That was exactly why he had been trying so desperately to get a second one. Lowering his head, Hiromi grew noticeably sad. Akari immediately sensed that a very personal part of his past had unexpectedly been revealed to her. Childhood memories began to flood the man's mind. He saw them running through the fields together, catching butterflies with a net, and walking until evening. Ayumi was 3 years younger than him and was always tagging along behind her brother. Whenever he warned her not to catch dangerous bugs and to come home, the girl would just reply carefree that she wasn't afraid of anything as long as she was with him, because her older brother would definitely protect her. They were together practically everywhere, at home, on walks, on the way to school. Ayumi almost never strayed from his side. Of course, sometimes Hiromi got annoyed. Because he constantly had to watch over his sister, he had much less freedom of his own. However, he never left her alone, and not at all because their mother had asked him to. The reason was something else entirely. Ayumi was very different from everyone else. She was very absent-minded, constantly tripping over things, and always covered in bruises and scrapes. She struggled with sports, and her studies weren't going well either. Because of her unusual behavior, she hardly fit in with the group and had practically no friends. That's exactly why Hiromi constantly felt responsible for her. But despite all this, the girl had an amazing talent. No one had specifically taught her to draw, yet Ayumi's paintings amazed everyone around her. Once, her work even won a gold award in a school contest. Even as a child, Hiromi realized that his sister was much more talented than he was. Gradually, his desire to protect her turned into something almost like a parent's care. Perhaps the fact that there was no father in the family also played a role. Without even realizing it, he began to see himself as the head of the family. However, it later turned out that all these feelings were just an illusion. As they entered their teenage years, the brother and sister gradually drifted apart. After graduating from high school, Hiromi got a job, moved out, and started living with his girlfriend. They began to see Ayumi only rarely. Although they continued to write to each other almost every day, she would tell him she'd bought new paints and ask when her brother would come home again. Everything changed after a casual joke. Hiromi's girlfriend once said that he was too obsessed with his sister. After that, Hiromi himself began to gradually push Ayumi away. In reality, he simply didn't want her to interfere with his relationship. At one point, he even asked his sister to stop texting him about trivial matters. And it worked all too well. The messages almost completely stopped. The next serious conversation didn't happen until several months later, when Hiromi came home for the holidays. His sister quietly confessed to him that she wanted to drop out of school. Surprised, her brother asked what had happened. With tears in her eyes, she told him that people were constantly making fun of her, and that every day felt like a form of bullying. She begged him to transfer her to another school where her old friends were studying. However, Hiromi didn't take her words very seriously. He decided that his sister was once again overreacting to ordinary teasing. Instead of offering support, he began telling her that she was already an adult and needed to learn how to build relationships with people on her own. He reminded her that it was precisely because of her poor preparation that she hadn't been admitted to the same school as her friends, and he attributed her problems with her studies and peers to a lack of effort. At the end of the conversation, the man simply said coldly that it was her own responsibility. With those words, he simply brushed her off. At the same time, he didn't think for a moment that he had abandoned his sister. He continued to pay for her art school, save money for her future studies at an art university, and was convinced he was doing everything right. But now he realized that it had all been nothing but self-deception. The following summer, on September 1st, Hiromi unexpectedly received a phone call. It was on that very day that Ayumi passed away. He later learned that, by that point, she had almost stopped attending school, had had a major falling out with her mother, and during summer break had even run away from home to be with a young man she'd met online. Her mother deliberately didn't tell her son anything, not wanting to burden him with new problems. After his sister's death, Hiromi felt almost nothing for a long time. During the funeral, he stood there with a blank stare, as if what was happening had nothing to do with him. However, over time, something inside him snapped. He became irritable, short-tempered, and aggressive. He lashed out at those around him more and more often, abused alcohol, and constantly got into conflicts. It even came to physical fights. The slightest thing would set him off. Gradually, his friends and co-workers turned away from him. Even his girlfriend, who had supported him for a long time, turned away from him. Left alone, Hiromi locked himself in his apartment and started drinking first thing in the morning. He barely ate, stopped taking care of himself, and existed like a living dead man. All the money he'd saved up, including the savings he'd set aside for Ayumi's future, gradually disappeared. When there was nothing left, he wandered aimlessly from city to city, until, finally, he returned to his parents' home, even though he had once sworn never to do that again. Sitting in his sister's room, looking at her toys, drawings, paints, and personal belongings, he recalled all the happy moments of their childhood over and over again. Just then, his mother quietly approached him and suggested they move. Fighting back the tears welling up in his eyes, Hiromi silently agreed. As they packed their things, he realized that there's a moment known as hitting rock bottom. It's that moment when a person finally realizes that it's no longer possible to go on living as before. For Hiromi, that moment came in the form of a letter. While sorting through Yumi's belongings, he found an envelope with drawings inside her nightstand. It was marked as being addressed specifically to him. Day after day, Hiromi looked at Yumi's letter over and over again. He tried to revisit those memories as little as possible, but each time he couldn't help but ask himself the same question. What was she thinking in the final moments of her life? For a long time, the man hesitated to open the letter. He felt certain that inside he would find words of hatred, for he believed his sister must have despised her cold and indifferent brother, who had turned his back on her at her darkest hour. However, when he unfolded the letter, he saw something completely different. Ayumi wrote that she felt very lonely because they had almost stopped talking to each other lately. She admitted that she really wanted to meet with her brother and just have a quiet chat, but she was afraid he would scold her again, so she decided to write a letter instead. She explained that she and her mother were also constantly arguing and barely speaking to each other, so she planned to leave a letter for her as well. Then Ayumi apologized for breaking down in tears recently and showing her weakness. She wrote that her brother was right about everything, and that she was the only one to blame. She failed her school exams because she was stupid. Her classmates started making fun of her because she's ugly. She should have studied more. She even regretted that she had once come to school wearing tinted lip balm. The girl recalled how she was told that with a face like hers, the only thing she could put on was lipstick. At the end of these lines, Ayumi apologized again for being such a worthless sister. She had caused her brother nothing but trouble ever since childhood. But then the tone of the letter changed. Ayumi realized that all she did was apologize. Although, in reality, she really wanted to say a huge thank you to her brother. She fondly recalled her childhood. She thanked him for always playing with her. She remembered how much she loved riding on the back of his bike as they raced down the hill at full speed, and the wind would blow right in her face. She remembered their favorite game in the bathroom, for which their mom was always scolding them. She wrote about how they used to play video games together. She especially loved racing games because she always lost to her brother in the other games. The girl also remembered his friends, who welcomed her into their group. They would go for walks together, play video games, and laugh. and she called those days the happiest of her life. However, the letter took a somber turn again. Ayumi asked if her brother remembered the wild duck eggs in the pond at the city park. Back then, they would come every day to see if the ducklings had hatched. But one day, someone smashed all the eggs. The girl wrote that was very cruel. After all, a broken egg can never be put back together. After that, she wondered if they had become just like that themselves. If a family falls apart, can it ever be put back together again? As he read these lines, Hiromi noticed a long, dried tear on the paper. It was obvious that at that very moment, Ayumi could no longer hold back her emotions. After reading the letter to the very end, the man stared for a long time at the unfinished sentence about how it was impossible to bring back the past. He gently traced his fingers over the traces of the dried tears. He realized that even if his sister had wanted to continue the letter, she would no longer have been able to do so. The tear stains alone were enough to make him realize what a terrible storm of emotion she had been hiding inside all this time. Unable to hold back any longer, Hiromi burst into tears. He didn't find any great meaning in life in that letter, nor did he receive answers to all his questions. But at that moment, he understood one thing with all his heart. He couldn't go on living like this. After that, the man literally threw himself into his work. He seized every opportunity to earn money. He almost completely gave up alcohol, which had previously helped him drown out his thoughts. And soon he saw an ad for urgent hiring at a chain of 24-hour stores. The job demanded total dedication. He could work practically without days off all year round. That was exactly what he needed at the time, to fill every free minute with work so he wouldn't have time to think. Hiromi quickly gained a reputation as an incredible workaholic. After a while, he was hired as a permanent employee, and later he even became the manager of his own store. His colleagues respected him for his calm demeanor. He never raised his voice over mistakes, listened attentively to others' problems, and always tried to help. Gradually, he earned a reputation as a kind manager. It was nice to hear such words. But now Hiromi understood the truth. All that kindness hadn't stemmed from nobility at all. It had grown out of a sense of guilt. All his actions were merely a desperate attempt to atone, even just a little, for his own mistakes. A mere substitute for compassion with which he tried to drown out the past. Over time, the man began to wonder about something else as well. Perhaps Ayumi had certain traits from birth that no one had noticed at the time. Her inability to get along with others, her extraordinary talent for drawing. Perhaps all of this was connected. Of course, he understood that one couldn't make a diagnosis based solely on books and articles from the internet. But these thoughts still wouldn't leave him alone. It was then that Hiromi first began to wonder if she was one of those children for whom things that seemed completely natural to others were simply out of reach. No matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't be like everyone else. If the reason was the differences she was born with, then he had absolutely no right to tell her that she simply wasn't trying hard enough. He especially often recalled the day when Ayumi, crying, begged him to let her drop out of school. At the time, he had coldly replied that it was entirely her own responsibility. Now, recalling his own words, the man felt a shiver run through his body. It seemed to him that it was precisely that ruthless remark that had been the final blow that had completely broken his sister. It was already impossible to change the past, but not a day went by without Hiromi thinking about what she should have done back then. He should have first acknowledged her vulnerability, accepted her just as she was, become her quiet support, and protected her from the whole world. Sometimes he imagined a completely different life. If he'd been there for her back then, Ayumi would have grown up happy. Perhaps one day, she would have stopped calling him Oni-chan like a child and started addressing him simply as brother. But ever since the end of that summer, that emotional wound had never truly healed. It didn't matter that he was now the store manager. It didn't matter that his income had increased or that those around him respected him. None of that could bring back the person he loved most. That's exactly why he eventually started visiting the dating service where Akari worked. There, he desperately sought, even if it was bought with money, at least a fleeting illusion of human warmth. As he browsed through the women's profiles, his eyes landed on Akari's photo, and he chose her. Now, the man finally understood the real reason behind his actions. He let Akari live with him, not because he was such a kind person. He helped her financially, protected her, dealt with her ex-boyfriend, and took care of her only because he wanted to prove to himself that he had become a different person. As if he were now capable of saving at least someone. Everything Akari had once said turned out to be true. All his concern was merely a way to ease his own conscience. At the same time, however, Hiromi realized something else. He didn't want to lose anyone else in his life who had already grown dear to him. That's exactly why, upon returning to the present, he quietly said that they could no longer meet outside of work. Immediately after saying those words, he felt tears roll down his cheeks of their own accord. He wasn't sobbing or screaming. They were simply flowing, and he could no longer stop them. Noticing this, Akari immediately moved closer and asked anxiously why he was crying. Hiromi hastily covered his face with his hand, smiled awkwardly, and tried to brush it off, saying that things weren't at all what they seemed. While the girl tried to figure out what had happened, the man was pondering the reasons behind his own feelings. Akari wasn't at all like Ayumi. She had a completely different personality, a different appearance, and a different way of behaving. And yet, the memories came flooding back with such force. Perhaps it was because her stage name was the same as his sister's. Or maybe it was because she had once called him Oni-chan. Whatever the reason, Hiromi realized one thing. The old wounds hadn't healed at all. They hadn't even begun to heal. The saying that time heals all wounds seemed to him like a cruel lie. Turning away, the man, barely holding back his tears, quietly apologized and said he was fine now. Akari immediately objected, saying that wasn't true. She could clearly see how he was feeling. Then Hiromi, still not turning to face her, awkwardly admitted that he had always been too soft-hearted. Perhaps he really had gone overboard with the money, but he'd helped her entirely of his own free will, so she didn't need to feel obligated in any way. However, in the very next second, he realized he was once again hiding behind his usual mask of kindness. These beautiful words only confused Akari even more. He no longer wanted to hide his true feelings. After a long silence, Hiromi suddenly said quietly that he'd eaten all the potato salad. Akari looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he was saying that. Lowering his head, the man asked her to come back and make the salad again. A gentle smile appeared on the girl's face. She cautiously asked again, "Is it really okay for me to stay?" She looked at him hopefully. Hiromi calmly replied that she could. Akari still couldn't believe what she'd heard and asked if that was really all he needed. The man nodded confidently once more. After a brief pause, the girl admitted that she might very well get into some kind of trouble again. Hiromi replied with a slight smile that he'd long since gotten used to handling such situations. Then Akari asked if she would be a burden to him. Hiromi calmly remarked that he'd long been used to dealing with difficult clients as well. Crossing her arms over her chest, the girl snorted in displeasure, without her earlier sadness, and said that, for the sake of propriety, he could have lied and called her not problematic at all. Hiromi honestly admitted that at times she really did seem very troublesome to him. Hearing this, Akari exclaimed indignantly and gave him a light punch on the shoulder with her fist. The man asked in surprise, "What are you doing?" In response, the girl began playfully hitting him a few more times, declaring that this was punishment for such words. Hiromi, laughing, hurried to apologize to her. Only then did Akari stop, smile gently, and say quietly that she would stay under his care a little longer. Hiromi calmly replied that the feeling was mutual. Slightly embarrassed, the girl admitted that she definitely wanted to pay him back all the money, even though she wouldn't be able to do so right away. Looking away, Hiromi suggested they consider that $1,000,000 as payment for the additional service of living together. Akari laughed out loud and asked in surprise, "What kind of hidden service is this that's never been mentioned in your price list?" Watching her sincere laughter, Hiromi thought of his sister again. For a brief moment, Akari's broad, carefree smile seemed to him to bear a faint resemblance to that faded image of Ayumi, like an old sepia photograph, which he still cherished in his memory. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.